So I'm Dean Bowman. I teach at NUA on the Games, Art and Design course, and I study at UEA. I'm doing a PhD looking at video games, the games industry and narrative. This is kind of my third year speaking at the NGF, so it's kind of a nice little tradition. So this talk is kind of quite academic, I guess. It's coming definitely from a scholarly kind of perspective rather than a industry one, but it's about how to look at the industry, and it's about a kind of emergent area of game scholarship that proposes to do that, called platform studies. So just by way of a summary then, there's a well-known debate in the academic study of games called the ludology-narratology debate, which largely dominated the field for the best part of a decade. In fact, if you were here a couple of years ago, you probably heard me talk about this in relation to Bloodborne. So I don't want to go over this long and winding debate, but if you're interested in, there's plenty of books and articles that touch upon it, and it's well summarised at the beginning of the article Game Studies Material Turn, which is an article that I'll be looking at in a bit. So I think this debate has been greatly overstated, the tension between storytelling and mechanics in games, basically, because it was an intrinsic part of like building the field of game studies. So it was about marking its boundaries off from other fields like literature and media studies, or emerging categories like new media that threaten to absorb games into a larger framework rather than treat them as specific objects of study. Regardless of whether the game was studied as a rule set or as a narrative structure, though, both sides agreed on one thing: that the game itself was the correct object of study, and that its full range of meanings could all be seen within it. This extreme focus on the text rather than the context that surrounds it is known as formalism, and has fallen out of favour in almost all academic disciplines since the 70s. As Ian Bogost suggests in his book Unit Operations, today, just short of 10 years after the first publication of Cybertext, which was Espen Aarseth's landmark publication that was seen as the kind of birth of ludology, video game studies has reaped what it sowed: functionalist separatism. So this debate has for years had the side effect of keeping everyone's attention firmly on the game as a text, separating it from its wider socio-political context, every bit as much as Johan Huizinga's famous notion of the magic circle supposedly seals players away from reality within the cocoon-like immersive space of the game. And I've kind of got the ring around the marbles to represent Huizinga's magic circle, which is a favourite metaphor of mine. Unlike the EA Sports slogan, which says it's all in the game, it's not all in the game. In their report on the topic, Thomas H. Appley and Darshana J. Main make a case for what they call the material turn in game studies, which they observe as a new set of trends in scholarship that crucially opens up the field to other disciplines rather than closing the borders down. So they say, we contend that work attentive to materiality has become a key thread in game studies and also a bridge to other disciplines. Such work exhibits an increased concern for the context, uses and material qualities of game technologies on the one hand, as well as attentiveness to the situated analysis of play and players on the other. Following other fields, particularly film and television studies, we can see a growing scholarly interest in the other side of the game text: the production contexts in which the games are made, the situations in which they're played, and even the larger geopolitical contexts, such as that explored brilliantly by Nick Dyer-Witherford and Greg DePuter in their book Games of Empire. And there's the cover of the book on the left, and there's a rather nice picture of Mario and Luigi by Jonathan Fletcher, setting out to solve the BP oil spill in Gulf of Mexico in 2011, placing Mario within real-world political context. So one aspect of this new focus that Appley and J. Main identify is that of platform studies, which is the study of specific standardized gaming formations such as consoles. This focus is crystallised in the MIT Press's Platform Studies series, developed by Nick Montfort and Ian Bogos to address the technological platforms underpinning video game production. Here's a statement from their website. We believe it's time for humanists to seriously consider the lowest level of computing systems and their relationship to culture and creativity. The Platform Studies series has been established to promote the investigation of underlying computing systems and how they enable, constrain, shape and support the creative work that is done on them. And there's a few examples of some of the books in that series focusing on specific consoles. Interestingly, as the series has moved forward, the notion of platform has been expanded to emphasise not simply the technological constraints and affordances of the technology, but the wider socio-economic and political context in which they sit. So Appley and J. Main see the framework provided by platform studies, while based in material concern, may be effectively connected to issues on a number of levels, both micro and macro. The materiality of platforms can be turned inwards to examine the individual components of a platform, and just as easily outwards to focus on the organisational structure that allows the platform to be produced. The genius of platform studies is to locate the platform as the stable object within this complex unfolding entanglement, allowing it to perform the role of a centre around which other relationships may be traced and examined. The latest entry in the series, Dominic Arsenault's study of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, in particular focuses on corporate economic policies, wider cultural perceptions promoted through marketing strategies, and the technological underpinnings of the system itself, each embodied in the book's eccentric three-part title, Superpower, Spoony, BARDS and Silverware. Arsenault even argues that the technological architecture of the SNES can be seen to reflect the conservative corporate culture of Nintendo itself. Speaking about the technological leap from the NES to the SNES, and disputing that it was a great step forward, he says, instead, the Super Famicom would pursue even further another kind of architecture that had been chosen with the Famicom, a decentralized networked mode of operation with specialized components dedicated to specific aspects of the process, like specialized silverware with different spoons for coffee, tea, soup and dessert. In doing so, the Super Famicom's technological architecture closely mirrored Nintendo's networked organisational structure. So this shift is only right since the industry's own social conception of the platform has changed drastically over time. When gaming first emerged, it was within the very adult context of the Pentagon-funded academic research into computing at academic institutions like MIT, which were the few places with the expertise and resources to maintain expensive mainframe supercomputers like the PDP-1. Both Space Wars and Adventure were the result of researchers unofficially dabbling with these supercomputers. And there's the computer that Space Wars was created on at the bottom there. Following this, computing moved to the vibrant hacker culture that had developed around the computing hotspots like Silicon Valley or MIT, a scene John Carmack and John Romero emerged from before coming to fame with Doom and developing id Software, a story that is explored in Kushner's biography Masters of Doom, which is a cracking read, by the way. When gaming became more public in the late 70s, it was around public arcades, which were considered notorious night spots frequented by adolescents and feared by parents. Arsenault has argued that the perception of video games being just for kids came as late as the early 80s, when Nintendo attempted to enter the American marketplace after the 1983 video game crash. It did so by positioning itself as a wholesome alternative to the arcade, reassuring parents of the family-friendly nature of its catalogue that was strictly controlled through rigid licensing agreements and the notorious Nintendo seal of quality. Later, Sega, Sony and Microsoft would successively extend the age of gaming's demographic reach, with the latter two companies seeing their consoles as hybrid media devices embedded in the family space of the living room rather than primarily a gaming device. Later still, Nintendo's return to form with the Wii once again reinvented and extended the audience of gaming in radical new ways, increasing accessibility and appealing to crucially neglected social groups such as women and the elderly. And that's explored in Jesper Juhl's book, A Casual Revolution. So this brief overview of the development of gaming demonstrates that neither the concept of video games or their audiences has ever been a stable, coherent identity. And the face of gaming is still changing. For instance, we have the emergence of mobile gaming off the back of technological developments of mobile phones and social networks, and we have the indie renaissance following digital distribution opportunities created by new technologies like broadband and platforms like Steam. But those of us who grew up during the 80s and 90s will surely remember the great console war between Sega and Nintendo, a period that is explored in Blake Harris's famous book Console Wars. This was embodied in some publicity campaigns that got pretty personal, like Sega's famous Sega Does What Nintendo Don't. It was also represented by an arms race of marketing buzzwords that attempted to convince the audience of the system's technical superiority. Sega had its blast processing, and Nintendo had Mode 7 graphics and its Super FX chip. Fighting on the front lines of the console wars were the company's mascots, Sonic and Mario, who not only starred in the studio's flagship first-party games, but totally represented the company ideologically in their publicity. Sonic wasn't just the iconic mascot of Sega's flagship console after all. He was an embodiment of the Sega desire to appear cooler, faster and more transgressive than Nintendo's podgy plumber, and their conservative and safe approach to development. But this was only possible as a result of the higher clock speed on the CPU and the bandwidth of the Mega Drive, which is kind of embodied in the idea of blast processing, if not the reality. And there's a little quote there from Giant Bomb, which overviews some of the affordances of that technology. So you're probably going to get sick of that image before I finish reading this quote. So the way technological allowances are bound up with aesthetics can be seen in the notion of the graphical regimes put forward by Dominic Arsenault and Pierre-Marc Cote. Here they have attempted to construct a theoretical framework for discussing particular configurations of game aesthetics that goes beyond a simple appreciation of style. They examine how these configurations close down or open up new gameplay possibilities. They say the graphical regime is to be understood as the junction point between gameplay and graphics, defined as the imaging of gameplay and the gameplay of the image, independently of the technological graphical capabilities or limitations. As such, it serves to describe the range of affordances that the game creators open or close for players as a result of visual configurations. And there's like a summary of some of the aspects they include in this idea of the graphical regime. So it's quite a wide concept, and the idea is that it makes new forms of gameplay possible. So an update in graphics isn't enough. The graphics and the way they're presented have to change the gameplay in some way. So the Sonic games thus embodied a new kind of graphical regime, since they allowed a very different form of gameplay. Sonic may be indistinguishable from any other platformer at first, but once he gets up to speed, the camera struggled to centre the speeding hedgehog as he dashed and looped through the level. It was almost as though the correct way to play was to avoid the platforms that Mario games built their intricate platforming around. Sonic was a product of the opportunities afforded by the technological platform, but his speed also highlighted those opportunities in the public imaginary, thus emphasising Sega's advertising rhetoric around blast processing. In short, he was both the embodiment and the promise of that system's technical prowess. We can see then how games and characters can be considered extensions of the technological platforms that made them, but can we go further and also consider game studios in this light too? Studios plug into a complex network of platform holders, publishers, retail outlets, third-party tool providers, outsourced studios and contractors. These external pressures have a huge bearing on the way they are funded and the kinds of games they are capable of making. Indie studios don't just flock towards 8-bit graphics out of a nostalgia for the golden age of the platformer genre, but because their art style is relatively easy to achieve on a tight budget. What was cutting edge and completely constrained by technology in Ghouls and Ghosts becomes a deliberate aesthetic choice in Shovel Knight. They cannot be interpreted in the same way because they belong to different historical moments produced by particular formations of cultural and technological factors that make up the different platforms on which they exist. Internally, there are pressures too. A company's corporate culture, size, and written documents have as much impact on the kind of games that can be made as the platforms they are released upon. Studios of all sizes within the games industry have long thought of their structure using the metaphor of a pipeline. This is described by Casey O'Donnell in Developer's Dilemma as the set of techniques, standards, and practices through which art assets and design data flow into the underlying game code. It's processed and ultimately displayed on the screen as a game. The pipeline has thus become a potent organising and structuring device in game development to explore the material ways assets flow into the game. But does it adequately describe the structure of a studio, or has it merely become a convenient metaphor that in fact obscures its actual functioning? Although the metaphor implies an orderly flow of ideas, it must be adapted to each production environment, just as plumbing must be fitted to the architectural quirks of each building. Thus, pipelines are highly specific to each game and team. Pipelines are dispensed and abstracted, made up of a motley assortment of individuals, technologies, and practices, and O'Donnell notes that seeing it in its entirety is difficult. Typically, each worker will have only a partial understanding of the pipeline as it relates to them and their section of the workflow. The larger the studio, the more developed its hierarchy and the more complex the processes that make up the game. Despite the best efforts to rationalise the process through team structures and design documents, we are dealing fundamentally with creativity, which is very hard to control or anticipate. In reality, the studio's pipework is far less organised and is closer to the convoluted warp pipes that make up Mario's World 7. Entering something in one end is far from clear when, where, or even if it will re-emerge. Here's an interesting example from Dion Lay, one of the writers of Alien Isolation, who I interviewed, about the origins of the fairly crucial idea of making the player character Ripley's daughter. I'm not going to read it all, but basically he had a chat with his roommate who was also working on the game, who posited the idea of making the character Ripley's daughter, and his response was, "Yeah, I just don't think it's going to work, Chris." And of course it became quite an important part of the game, and filtered back up in the planning process later on. So such a significant part of the game's narrative only emerged as a result of a coincidence of two team members from different departments living together and having a conversation. The idea was dismissed only to reappear later. We can see how in large complex teams ideas can flow from all sorts of directions. A significant shift in the organisation of the pipeline has been the growing popularity of lean production paradigms like Agile or Scrum. These approaches derive from lean production methodologies pioneered by Toyota as an alternative to mass production in the auto industry, and were first named by James Womack, Daniel T. Jones, and Daniel Roos in their book The Machine That Changed the World. Such design paradigms emphasize flexible technologies and approaches, as well as flattened hierarchies to rapidly facilitate iteration of ideas, crucial for the creative industry's context. The design process is broken down into planned sprints, and regular meetings offer a crucial point for feedback and assessment. The image at the bottom of the page is a typical example of how a Scrum project, which is derived from Lean and Agile, is managed. Such a pattern of development perfectly matches the function of an independent studio with a small workforce, as can be seen from this comment from Ryan Payton of Camouflage Studios. He basically says that designing is like playing jazz, and says later on, the way that I like to work is I like to get us all into the room, I like to put all of the problems on the board, and I try to map out what our solutions are. So emphasising this collaborative process. Through actively adopting lean production paradigms like Agile and Scrum, larger companies are arguably attempting to replicate some of the advantages of a small and nimble indie team, allowing them to solve considerable communication issues between large departments by reorganizing the company structure into strike teams made up of interdisciplinary groups of developers to work on problems together. So you have artists, coders and level designers sitting together and interacting more. Similarly, Casey O'Donnell has noted that relatively new kind of interstitial roles have emerged to create links between departments. The tools developer and the technical designer facilitate the flow of ideas between the programmers and the designers. Meanwhile, the community manager acts as a point of exchange between the studio and its player base, a relationship that is rapidly changing thanks to the shift towards gaming as a long-term service industry rather than an individual product that you play and dispose of. But replacing the metaphor of the pipeline with a platform, although it elegantly links the social production context with its technological counterpart, doesn't tell us much about how this particular construction works. For this, we need a new tool in our arsenal. I propose actor network theory, which is a highly practical means for articulating these often obscured processes. Actor network theory, affectionately named ANT after the industrious and organised insect whose activities it mimics, emerged from pioneering anthropological studies of the scientific and engineering communities by Bruno Latour, Michel Callon and John Law, particularly Latour's analysis of the process of fact construction in the scientific community, laboratory life. According to Latour, a network is an entity made up of active mediators that have a transformative effect on the data flowing through them, rather than intermediaries that merely pass inputs on without affecting them. The pipeline incorporates both human and technological mediators, through which traces of ideas and assets can be followed and observed as they flow into the text, as well as the organizational systems and apparatus that underpin the pipeline. According to Latour, things only leave social traces that allow them to be studied if they are actively under formation or become controversial in some way. If something is taken for granted, it slips into the background and becomes silent. Although the pipeline fundamentally shapes and constrains the possibilities of game design, it often slips into the background, becoming one of Latour's silent objects. This is compounded by the highly secretive nature of the games industry, as O'Donnell has observed in Developer's Dilemma. The structures that underpin production only become apparent again when they break down. Such breakages or controversies provide key moments for inquiry, since the hidden structures that guide production become apparent. As Bruno Latour illustrates with an example from anthropology, occasionally when an anthropologist is lucky enough to witness the disintegration of a tribe and the subsequent creation of a new settlement, he can catch a glimpse of those rules of behaviour that remain hidden during periods of normal activity. A good recent example of this is the controversies around the uses of loot boxes in Star Wars Battlefront 2, which suddenly made the relationship between the developer, the publisher, and the license holder much clearer, since they were all forced to make public statements on the issue. In another example, in No Collar, Andrew Ross's landmark examination of the New York design consultancy Razorfish during the dot-com boom and bust, the Razorfish employees only become aware of the company hierarchy as the company begins to dissolve. In the period leading up to this, the studio operated under an extremely flattened hierarchy, which gave the workers the false belief they had a real stake in the studio. Many critics of the cultural industries have noted that such strategies to keep the workforce invested only help to disguise their exploitation, and this is something that's been analysed quite heavily in the games industry. A strength of ANT is that it places objects on the same plane as humans, thus avoiding the tendency to overprivilege the individual genius in the process of innovation, which normally obscures a much larger picture. These non-human actors affect changes in the network in the same way that humans do, and are often crucial in developing ideas and technologies. One example is the game engine. Game engines are software assemblages that facilitate the flow of art assets, code, physics and other game elements into the game. They are either created in-house according to specific demands of the game or licensed from third-party studios, like the Unreal Engine developed by Epic. In the latter case, engines that are brought in must often be modified or adapted to the particular demands of the game or augmented with additional third-party software tools. In Games of Empire, Nick Dyer Witherford and Greg DePuter note that the reason the first-person shooter genre has been dominant for so many years is partly because of gaming's historic links to the military, sometimes referred to as the military entertainment complex, as well as the cultural legacy of 9/11 and America's war on terror. But it is also because the key game engines were developed around that genre, making it easier to make those games. Game engines can be thought of as pieces of apparatus or inscription devices in Bruno Latour's terminology. Latour noted how specific machinery, like spectrometers, were often developed in other fields of science to solve specific problems before being utilized in new fields where they became black boxes, since it was no longer required to know exactly how they worked. As a consequence, all the money, time and expertise spent developing the machine were reified within it. But so too were certain assumptions and approaches that guided the original research. He says, by borrowing well-established knowledge and by incorporating it in pieces of furniture or in routine operational sequences, the laboratory can harness the enormous power of tens of other fields for its own purposes. Once a string of operations has been routinized, one can look at the figures obtained and quietly forget that immunology, atomic physics, statistics and electronics actually made this figure possible. Concepts are transformed into routine apparatus, which are used to more efficiently create new concepts, which can then be translated once more into apparatus in a new laboratory or game studio. These material objects are inscribed with the ideas that constitute them and thus further constrain the kinds of scientific or creative outputs they can produce. This also holds true of the game engine, many of which bear the traces of legacy code belonging to the games for which they were originally designed. In the opening of the beginner's guide, The Stunningly Self-Reflexive Indie Game by Davey Reedon, the narrative voice of the game comments upon how Valve's source engine, in which the game is built, is suited to the construction and traversal of internal geometric spaces like corridors, and relates this to its origins in the development of the first-person shooters such as Counter-Strike. And as you can see, the game literally tries to explode that concept and constraint. Sneak preview. The development and emergence of Unity has perhaps done more to shake up game design than any other apparatus. Its extreme flexibility and accessibility makes it appropriate for a much wider range of games and much less specialized teams. This, along with the fact that it was freely available, has made it extremely popular with the indie game community, allowing many more experimental and highly personal games to be made. For Casey O'Donnell, the openness of Unity as a system also challenges the secrecy of the games industry. The explosion of excitement surrounding development tools like Unity 3D are due almost entirely to how these software systems illuminate the previously obscured territory of flexible technologies. The methods and practices used to actively produce games have remained the black art of game development. Technology has not held developers back nearly as much as obsessive secret keeping and the naive neglect of practice have. As platform studies suggests, the emergence of new technology is vital in allowing for new forms of expression, but these new forms of expression also impact the spread and uptake of that technology. This moment of shifting cultural and technological ideas, creating new aesthetic possibilities, is reminiscent of the success of the French New Wave and its impact on international cinema culture in the late 1960s. The French New Wave, or Nouvelle Vague, had both a cultural and a technological midwife. The key directors, Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut and Eric Romer, were initially writers on the prestigious French journal Cahiers du Cinéma. Where they rebelled against the old studio-driven method of filmmaking in France they dismissed as cinéma du papa, granddad cinema, and pioneered a new mode of thinking about cinema that privileged the director as an artist called auteur theory. Their cultural clout as critics established a new mode of thinking about cinema that paved the way for their success as filmmakers. The movement also coincided with and depended upon the emergence of an influential new technology of 16mm handheld cameras that allowed greater access to the means of filmmaking. This technology also allowed the camera to be moved far more easily, requiring less crew and making filmmaking closer to writing. These new cameras allowed the directors of the French New Wave to make good on their rejection of the established conventions of making films on elaborate sets in studios by allowing them to make films out in the streets with raw aesthetics and personal stories about the real experiences of young people, rather than the overwrought historical dramas that defined French cinema at the time. As the indie scene develops around an understanding of small teams making very personal games, the auteur theory has understandably gained a foothold in games culture too. Whereas before only a handful of celebrated developers existed in AAA, such as Shigeru Miyamoto, Hideo Kojima and Shinji Mikami, now the indie scene has delivered a constellation of such figures. In particular, Tom Francis, the one-man developer of Gunpoint and Heat Signature, shares a peculiarly similar trajectory to the directors of the French New Wave. He began as a games journalist at PC Gamer before teaching himself game development and making a successful foray into the indie sphere. So, acting as black boxes, these inscription devices like game engines not only themselves embody decades of iteration and thousands of hours of labour, but also bear residual traces of code, assumptions, value systems, and inevitably have an influence upon the production at hand, reinforcing the notion of the studio as a platform. In a very real sense, the final product, the game potentially millions of people will play or become aware of, is a reification of all the creative and management decisions, processes, functions carried out by apparatus and other conditions of production that lead up to it. Just as much as the console it is played upon, it becomes a black box sent into the world, built from an unfathomable code base, only accessible by the most dedicated hackers wielding the most elaborate programs. The processes with which it is constructed become invisible, becoming a mute object that leaves no sociological trace in Latour's terms. The material factors of its existence, once so important, only lingering as implications barely discernible via the ephemeral inscriptions the game leaves upon our screens, or in the potentially unreliable anecdotes told by developers in GDC talks. This leaves us the significant problem of how to access these inner workings once the project has crystallized into a black box. Black box, kind of like the monolith from 2001, which I've always thought looks like the PlayStation 4. So I hope that this talk has suggested some potentials for opening that black box. To summarise, we can use actor network theory in conjunction with platform studies to help map the complex and shifting games industry within its larger networks of social and technological factors. We can look for controversies, ruptures and new formations as ways into the industry. We can reconsider pipelines as networks made up of objects and human actors that transform ideas as they pass from node to node, and we can trace these transferences through documentation and interviews. We can consider structures like engines and even platforms themselves as inscription devices that embody an entire process within their production, including specific ideologies that constrain the types of games that can be made. We can open up the black box of game development and understand more fully how it functions so as to avoid the pitfalls of ascribing innovation solely to individual creative geniuses. In doing so, we can better understand the true complexities and interdependencies of the video game industry. Thank you.